Welcome back to Maya 101. This is Michael. In our last video, we started talking about lights and lighting. We went to the Create menu, lights here, kind of break this little menu off, and we talked about many of these lights and different things you can do with them. So when it comes to lighting, that's one part of the equation, because after lighting, well, first of all, after modeling, then you do all your UVs, you do your textures, you do your lighting, and then it's time to render. So rendering is a big process. I mean, it takes a long time sometimes, depending on the scene. If you have a lot of stuff going on and you try to render the scene, it can take a long time. So I tell my students to make sure you give yourself some leeway when it comes to how long it's going to take to render an animated sequence, for example. If they're going to do like a 10-second scene and they want to render it, I might tell them, you need to start rendering like the week before, because it could potentially take you days to render, depending on how strong your computer is. If you got a really top-notch computer, it might not take long at all. So just something to keep in mind. Also, when it comes to rendering, that's not something that we necessarily worry about in the video game industry that I have experience with. In the video game industry, video games are considered real-time, meaning they're not rendered. I mean, there is rendering involved, but it's real-time rendering. It's rendering right now. So when you press a button, your character can jump and so on and respond to your commands. However, if you render something as is typically understood, you render a scene, that's like a movie. Like Pixar will render their movie sequences. And that's not something that you can press a button and have, Buzz Lightyear jump. Unless it's in a video game, right? But when you go to the theater, it's all rendered. Or they call it also pre-rendered, as opposed to real-time rendering. So real-time rendering is video game engines such as Unreal or Unity, and you're running a video game and it's rendering the scene in front of you, but it's real-time. Things are being processed as you're seeing it. Then there's pre-rendered, or just rendered if you'd rather, which is a film or a video. Something that you render a sequence, you edit it, you take it into, say, After Effects or Premiere or something like that, and do post-processing and things like that. You add sound effects, and just like you would a film. And that is rendering your scene. So Maya can definitely render a scene a la like Pixar or something like that. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So rendering your scene. So first of all, the way you start the rendering process is you have to set up your scene to render. So the main place we're going to go is up here in our user interface, next to that blue cue ball, which is the hypershape we've talked about before. Just to the left of that is this little film clackerboard icon with a little blue gear in the corner. And as you can see there in the tooltip, it says Display Render Settings. I'm going to click this. This opens up this window here. So right here it says render using, and you'll see mine is set to using a system called the Arnold renderer. Now yours may not say that, depending on what plugins you have installed on your machine. Yours might say Maya software, for example. And you'll notice as I chose that new option, all these settings here change, depending on what's involved here. So depending on what system you're using to render your scene with, you have different settings. Maya software is considered a basic Maya rendering system. It comes with Maya. Maya is the one who set this up. Now Arnold is a higher performance rendering system, as in it's better quality. There's more to it than that though. There's a lot of stuff that goes along with the Arnold renderer. So if you don't have the Arnold renderer, which you probably do, if you don't see it here though, what we need to do is turn on the plugin. So the way we can do that is we go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager, and we're going to do a search for MTOA. This is Maya to Arnold, MTOA. So if you notice it here and it's not checked as loaded and auto load, then you can do that now and then hit refresh. And that should You can probably close this and then reopen the render settings. You should then see the Arnold renderer system as an option. So most versions of modern Maya, I should say, ship with the Arnold plugin pre-installed, typically. It's very possible, it may not for you, but most of the time, for the last several versions, for the last several years, the Arnold renderer has shipped with Maya. And the Arnold renderer, so there's there's a couple ways you can think about this. Number one, I could say, okay, Maya software is the basic one. Let's talk about that. And then I can say the Arnold renderer is the better one. Let's talk about that. But then you're never going to use the Maya renderer again. So there's a back and forth in my mind as far as how I go about my students. When I first started teaching, I would teach them the Maya software render system, and then we would transition to Arnold, and they would never go back. There's no reason to. The Arnold renderer is so much better than the typical Maya renderer is. So then the last several years I was teaching, I was like, well, there's no real reason to waste people's time then, right? As opposed to dealing with the typical basic Maya renderer, why not just go straight into Arnold and not beat around the bush, so to speak, or waste people's time? So depending on what you think about that, you might not, or you might not like, or you might like how we're going to go forward. Because what I want to do is go ahead and transition to Arnold now, as far as this Maya 101 sequence, or the series on YouTube here. Because like I said, once you learn how to use Arnold, there's no reason really to go back and use the Maya software renderer, because Arnold is so much better. It's very much a superior product. However, what that means is that we have to go back and retouch some of the topics we've talked about before and add the Arnold twist to them. Because a lot of the things we've talked about previously now have an Arnold kind of peppering of settings that we need to talk about at least. So before we get into rendering, which is what we're going to do, let's go back real quick to the hypershade. So I'm going to click on this blue cue ball icon to bring up the hypershade. I'll just make it a big part of the window here. And so we've talked about, if I go to the surface materials that we have, we talked about the blend, and we've talked about the Lambert, and there's obviously more here. However, you look down here, there's Arnold. There's an Arnold section to this create menu here in the hypershade. So when dealing with Arnold, you actually have specific materials just for rendering an Arnold renderer. In other words, you're not going to use the blend and the Lamberts and the Fongs and so on that you saw in that previous list. Instead, you're going to use materials that are for Arnold, because that's the materials that Arnold prefers to render with, and they look better with the Arnold rendering system. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you the basic Arnold material. It's called the AI Standard Surface Material. I'll click it once here, and this brings up this material here, and you can see the settings over here as well. So, the AI Standard Surface Material, that's what this is called here. This is the basic Arnold material, and what I would recommend doing is if anything you've made in the past and you wanted to render it, well, you might want to look into the Maya software renderer. And there are videos here on my channel. There's other videos on YouTube that go over it. However, we're going to talk about Arnold moving forward. And so that would mean converting your materials to be Arnold materials. And that also includes the textures and so on. So first of all, let's look over here in the property editor. And you see here I have AI Standard Surface. I'm actually going to create a blend just to show you like a difference. So here's blend down here, typical blend material. We've looked at this before, color, transparency, and so on. Eccentricity, specular color, reflectivity, all these sorts of things. And then back to the Arnold Standard Surface. So number one, you'll notice that the way this is sectioned into different categories, you see there's lots of them, transmission, subsurface coat, they're much different than the blend. The blend has these common material attributes, specular shading, and so on, that are very common throughout all the basic Maya materials. But the Arnold one has different categories. We have base, and then we have specular, transmission, subsurface, coat, sheen, emission, and so on. And if you were to expand some of these, let's say emission or coat or transmission, you'll notice that they all start with a weight slider. Let me close some of these back up. Not all of them, but a lot of them start with a weight slider. And you'll notice here for base, the weight value is all the way up to 1. And essentially what that means is, if the weight value is all the way up to 1, then everything within this section is active and is actually being applied to the material. Okay? If the weight is 0, everything in this section is not active. It's not being applied to the material. You'll notice it went to black. So this color here, this is a kind of gray color. Let's say I change this color to pink, just for the sake of example. If I take the weight to 0, that pink is no longer applied. Take it up to 1, the pink is applied. And then of course there's value between 0 and 1 where it's partially applied. Okay, but typically your weight will be either 0 or 1 if you want this base section to be applied. Okay, let's go make this back to a gray color. Same for specular. So if specular's weight is set to 1, then all of this stuff underneath that is on. If it turns the specular weight to off, then everything underneath this is off. And you'll notice here that the material now has become essentially a Lambert. Okay, so the AI standard surface can be a Lambert with the specular weight to 0, or it can be like a blend with specular weight up to 1. Okay, so that's what the weight slider means. So transmission, for example, if you open it up, the weight is all the way down to 0. So the transmission is not by default turned on. And what transmission is, what turns up, is transparency. You'll notice here with transmission weight all the way up, I'm suddenly looking at a translucent or transparent material. So that transmission equals transparency, essentially. And so I've turned the weight for transmission and everything beneath here on by turning it up to 1. Taking the weight down to 0, the transmission no longer applies. And you see it all gets grayed out. Okay. Subsurface. Okay, so subsurface scattering is a setting that can be used for things like skin and plants and things like this, where the light kind of gets absorbed into the surface and bounces around and then scatters around and bounces back out. So by subsurface by default is 0, turn it on to 1, now subsurface is on. Okay, and then we can play with these settings and so on. So anything that you can see here where the weight is 0, just keep in mind that means that anything else in here is not having any effect. That's the biggest thing to know about this. So by default, typically these top 2 sections are turned on, base and specular, and then most of these other things are turned off. Okay, and we're going to get into more of this stuff as we go forward, but let's keep that in mind. That's what the basic thing you know about the AI standard surface material. Okay, so the AI standard surface is the material that we're going to use going forward for almost anything that we're going to render with Arnold. Now there are other Arnold materials. Click over here again, the Arnold shader category. You'll see there's other things here, but a lot of these would be very specific to what they are referring to. For example, you do have an AI Lambert or an AI matte. You also have, let's see here, we have AI standard hair. So specifically for hair, we have a material for that, for Arnold. Things like that. 99% of the time, though, I use an AI standard surface and just mess with these settings here to get what I want to happen for anything that I'm working on. Okay. Another thing to note about the AI standard surface material is presets. If you look up here, we have this preset button. If I click this, you'll see that it comes with lots of presets for different types of materials. For example, gold. If I choose gold, I mouse over gold, you have these settings here. And the first one is replace, then replace all selected, and then we have these different blend percentages. So first of all, replace means that it's going to change all of the settings of your material to be this preset gold material. So I'll do that now. There we go. So all the settings that it needed get turned on. Here we go. Nope, not that one. not sure what all these got turned on or not. Some of these get turned on, some of these don't. It looks like this one's mainly just using these top two. It's got some color changes and so on, but here you can see, without me having to do much of anything, it turned into gold, essentially, right? Then I go back to presets, and let's say I want to go to, say, glass. So if I go to replace, that means everything that I just did with gold is going to be replaced completely to look like glass. However, if I want to try to blend the gold preset with a glass preset, I can say, you know what, I want to blend, say, 25% glass onto my gold. Or I just replace it completely. So it just depends on what you want to do here. Replace it completely, and now it just gets changed to a glass material or glass shader. You'll see now transmission has been turned on. We have different settings here for transmission that we didn't have before. And it's like these other ones are not turned on for that one. We'll go to presets again. How about we look at skin replace. So it's kind of a Caucasian default skin color, but we do have, we'll go down here under subsurface. Now this has been turned on with these different colors, and we can change these colors. Coat has a little bit of weight there. Nothing for sheen and things, but that's okay. So again, I'm just showing you all these presets here we can replace. Here's a balloon preset. You see some of these are grayed out now. Coat has gone all the way up to 1 now, so we're using the coat, which is like a coating, a thin coating over top of the material. That's what coat does, the coat section. Anyway, I just wanted to show you this, that we have all these different presets, and obviously we don't have everything here. Like you don't see, for example, I don't know, you don't see, say, paper. Yeah, I don't see a paper preset. So in that case, you'd either have to find something that was similar enough to kind of start with. Let's say we went with, I don't know, rubber. Okay, and then like, all right, now I can start starting from here. I can go through and change to make it look more like paper. Or you just start from scratch and adjust the sliders yourself to make it look enough like paper, such as removing all the specular, for instance, because paper is very matte, and going from there with color and so on. Okay, so the AI standard surface material is, again, the go-to material I use when rendering with Arnold. I'm going to close this for now. Let's go back to lights. Well, first of all, at the same time, at the top of the menus, you'll now see I have an Arnold menu. An Arnold menu. And under the Arnold menu, there is a lights section. You see that? So Arnold actually has its own set of lights. I could go to the Create menu and look at lights, and we have these lights. I'll break this off again. Or go to the Arnold menu and lights. I can break this off. So we see we do have a lot of different lights here in the Arnold section than we do in the default section. Now both of them have an area light, but you'll notice that the area light for the Arnold light is a little bit different icon, so it's not the same light, but it's similar in how it's used. If I click on it, you'll see it's a square again, similar to the area light that we saw in the previous video. Things like this. And area lights are used probably a lot more often using Arnold than we do otherwise. But let me close this, or delete that I should say. Let me bring up one of the default lights, the directional light again. So this is our directional light, just like we looked at last video. Same idea. However, you'll see down here we do have an Arnold section under the light. So I can open this up, and we do have a lot of settings here, such as cast shadows and things like this. Now you might say, well, we also have this shadows section here, but here's the thing. The Arnold rendering system only pays attention to this. So you might say, oh, I'm going to turn off this button that says use ray trace shadows, which turns off shadows. However, if this is under the Arnold section, if it still says cast shadows, then it's still going to cast shadows in the Arnold renderer. This is for the Maya standard, or the Maya basic rendering system that we're not using anymore, right? Because the Arnold one is so much better. So the Arnold section you're going to pay a lot more attention to now if you're going to be rendering with Arnold. And so you have to kind of get used to that now. So again, we just kind of started talking about lights in the last video. So all these things are still the same. It's just we're going to look in the Arnold section for things like cast shadows and such. There's also exposure and samples and things like this we'll get to in a bit. I can go over here to the Arnold light section over here, And actually, let's go ahead and do a comparison. Like here's a standard area light, and then here's the Arnold area light. Put it kind of side by side here. So the one on the left, I'm going to hide the grid. The one on the left is the Maya standard area light. The one on the right is the Arnold area light. A little bit of different color differentiation. And as far as settings go, we have the settings we looked at last video: color, intensity, decay rate. But for the Arnold one, we have a lot more options here, a lot more settings. This light shape, you can see we can actually have like a cylinder or a disc. We have different options here than just a square. We have spread, resolution, all kinds of stuff to play with here as far as how the light looks. And then with this one, again, it's the basic one. We do have an Arnold section. Open that up and scroll down here. And let's compare these two. We have some of the same things. We have, for example, exposure, as we do with this one. So a lot of the same settings here. You have to play with these lights and see which you like better. Typically, the Arnold lights work best with Arnold than the default lights. However, the default lights do have Arnold settings, so you can use them. Okay, so let's just get an example here of how we can render with Arnold. Close this out. I'm just gonna see. We've got this stuff here. So again, it's kind of similar to the scene I worked with last time, where we had a couple shapes here in the scene. I'm just gonna make a cube here. And now the difference is I'm going to assign AI standard surface materials instead of Lamberts, because here I have a green Lambert applied. I'm going to right click and hold, assign a new material, and instead of one of these, I'm going to click on the Arnold section, Arnold category, and then apply AI standard surface. And then I can change the color to that green color if I want. Okay. This one has this kind of sky blue Lambert. I'm going to right click and hold, assign new material, Arnold AI standard surface. I go to the color, apply that kind of sky blue material again. And then for this new one, I haven't done it yet. I'm just going to right click and assign a new material, Arnold AI standard surface. I'll make it like red. Okay. And then I'm going to need some lights in my scene. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the Arnold menu, lights, and I'll get an area light. Okay, we'll just kind of scale it up, and just going to point it at my scene here. Now press the 7 key, if you remember, S for lighting. Don't see much. You might need to increase the intensity quite a bit, if you remember. Here's an intensity of 500. Okay, so you can see here we're using the AI standard surface materials here in the Maya viewport. We're getting a little bit different effects than we did with like a standard Lamberts or something. You see here we do have this kind of reflective look of this light here in the scene. As I move that light around, you can kind of see it reflecting in the surface. But one thing I want to be sure that you understand is when you're dealing with Arnold specifically, the preview that we get in the viewport here could be very drastically different than the rendered look of the scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Panels, Layouts. I'll do 2 panes side by side. And for this right side, I'm going to Panels, Panel, and let's do Render View. So this is the render view window. I'll make it big enough so you can see all this stuff here. This is where we can render an image. So if I look up here at the top, this drop-down menu is telling me what my rendering system is set to, which is currently Arnold. We'll close the outliner here just to get some view. And then this button on the left side is going to kick off a render. It's going to render the current frame. And the current frame is what I'm looking at over here on the left side. I'll just click this button once, and it will start rendering. See that? And there we go, it's done. So if I zoom in, what I can actually do is just to make sure I'm seeing what I want to see over here, I can go to View, Camera Settings, and look at Resolution Gate. And this is giving me this kind of preview here, so I know exactly where everything is going to be when I render it. Actually, let's look at it this way, where things are being lit in front. So you see how I'm framing these objects over here. When I render this way, that's the view we're going to get in our render. You can see it's kind of progressively rendering out the scene. All right, there we go. So a couple things I want to point out. You can see here it's a bit grainy. We're going to talk about how to improve that. But what I'm also wanting to point out is, and you may not necessarily know this because we didn't, this is one of those caveats of not going through the basic Maya renderer beforehand, is we're getting a lot of nice bounce color from that green surface is bouncing up onto our our blue and red blocks. And in the standard Maya surface, we don't see that kind of stuff. This is something that is unique to the Arnold renderer. It gives you that automatic bounce that we don't see otherwise, which is really nice. This top left button again will kick off a render. Okay. Now one thing I could do is instead of using the render view, like I see here, we could go up here to the Arnold menu and look at the open Arnold render view. This is a separate render view from the standard render view. If I click this, so this window here, you'll see is a little bit different than the other. There we go. I had it docked over here on the side. Couldn't quite see it. There it is. All right, so now I can hit this red play button. Play. That's going to again render the sequence, or render the image, I should say. And you can see it's kind of progressively going around. So this is the Arnold render view, different than the standard render view. And what happens is with this one is I can actually rotate my camera. You'll notice that it will update in real time. If I stop rotating my camera, it'll continue to refine the image until it is completed rendering, but I can always just keep rotating it around. And so one thing that's nice about this is I can see my lights and such in real time. So I can grab my area light. Let's say I expand my, let's undock this actually. Let's dock it, let's see if we can get it right here. There we go. So I can see my attributes. And so, for example, I can adjust my spread value, and you can see the difference there in real time. One thing that's nice about working with this is if you have multiple monitors, you can put the render view on one monitor and work on the other monitor, that kind of thing. Since I'm recording this, it's hard to kind of get the screen space for that. But you can kind of see as I rotate my camera, look around, I can get different, I can look at it from different angles, rotate my light around, you can see the render update. And again, it's very grainy at first, that's okay. Let's say I add another light to my scene. I'm going to Control D to duplicate this light, and then I'll move it over here and rotate it. I can say use color temperature, and I can make it cooler or warmer. Higher temperature is kind of backwards from what you expect. Higher temperature is more of a bluish tone. Lower temperature is more of a warm tone. I can do the same thing over here. I can go a kind of bluish tone on this side, warmer tone on that side. If I turn off cast shadows for both lights, you'll see the shadows turn off. So we'll make sure cast shadows is turned on for something. All right, so anyway, so you can kind of see here, it's very cool that you can like rotate the scene in real time and see the difference in the render view, which is a big plus as far as compared to the more basic rendering system. So with Arnold, I highly recommend playing with this a bit because it's going to take some getting used to. And we've barely scratched the surface here. So how do we make it better quality? Because we have a lot of grain happening, especially when it comes to, say, the shadows that are being cast and so on. Well, first of all, if I go back to those render settings we looked at before, so the blue cue ball icon up here and then one to the left, and here are the render settings. Let's move this over here. Let's go through this. So I want to render something, and like spit out an animation or something like that. So first of all, we have the Common tab, the Arnold Renderer tab, System tab, AOV tab, and Diagnostic tab. We're not going to go through all that today, but just kind of look at the basics. First of all, the Common tab. This is the tab that we're going to use for naming our frames and naming things. So let's say file name. Let's say I name this to be, you know, Maya 101. And then we can go down here. We can say what kind of image format. So are we looking at rendering JPEGs, Targas, TIFFs, EXRs, PNGs, whatever the case may be. EXRs are a high density, high quality image format. We could do that. JPEGs are a lower one. TIFF is kind of somewhere in the middle, I would say. Let's do TIFF, for example. Different settings here. I'm not going to mess with some of these. Frame/animation extension. So single frame means this is set to only render a single image. If you wanted to render a sequence, let's say we wanted to do like an animation, which we are going to talk about in this series, just haven't talked about it yet. We can change this to be, in my opinion, the best one is name_number.extension. And up here at the top, you'll see here we have examples of the file name. You see it says Maya101_0001.tiff and so on. So the frame padding, I'm going through a lot of stuff here, I get it. But essentially these settings here are going to let you name your images that you render. And it's going to spit out a sequence. It'll be numbered 1 through 10, for example. So we have start frame is frame 1, end frame. Let's say you wanted to render 1 second of animation, which is 30 frames. So you could say start frame is frame 1, end frame is frame 30, and that would render 30 pictures, which would all equal to be 1 second of animation. So you tell it where to start, where to stop, which camera to use. If you have multiple cameras in your scene, you would choose the camera to use. We have just perspective right now, that's fine. Then we have image size, like how big is the actual image. So like standard televisions, for example, you might have HD 1080 or something, or even higher than that these days. Go to 4K or something like that, really large. There we go, 4K square, HD. And we have NTSC, we have PAL if you're looking at European formats. So all these different kinds of formats here. You can also put in your own custom numbers. So here's 1080, and you see the image changes here. Zoom out. I'm actually zooming out my camera, actually. There we go. Oops. So this is all for naming your frames, as well as naming or how large the image is and where it's going to be saved to. So you can see here it's being saved to my Maya Toolbelt folders. I'm still set to the pencil from before, but that's okay. So this is what the Common tab is for. Now when it comes to the Arnold renderer, click on that tab here. So here we have what's called sampling. Now we've talked about samples slightly in the past in this video, but samples, the more samples you give the rendering system, the longer it's going to take, number one, but the more information it tries to render and the smoother it gets. Okay, so typically you see here with this the basic settings that we have a lot of grain happening. If we look at this. So this camera, we have these different sliders for increasing our samples. Camera AA is kind of a overall sample slider. So if I were to increase this one, it's going to sample everything more. Let's say if I go instead of 3, I'm change it to 5, for example. So it's going to start rendering again, and it's going to take a little bit longer this time. And as we go through it, hopefully you'll see that the grain is less. It may not be gone completely, but it's less than it was. And there's lots of settings here, more than we have time to really go over. But typically the sample values themselves are going to, the higher they are, the better quality the render will be. Now there's other places you can have samples too. Like if I have my lights selected right now, you'll see here in the area lights settings, we have samples. So I can give each light individually more samples. So let's say I give this one 2 samples and click on this other light and give it 2 samples. Nope, not 12, 2. Okay, so now it's kicking off another render again because I made that change. And you see I have 5 samples set for my camera. Let's go ahead and just make this 8. So really increase the samples. Now you're going to see this render is going to take a lot longer. And you see these little squares as they're traveling around and they're kind of fine-tuning the image. But you see here, instead of it being so quick, because the previous one rendered in just seconds, right? Now it's taking a lot longer to go through this, and this is a relatively simple scene here, just a couple shapes, a couple lights, and a couple materials. A lot longer, though, the render now with increasing the sample size. So by increasing those samples, though, you're going to get a much higher quality image. You'll see here now that that grain is much less than we were getting before. So what I recommend to my students is when it comes to lighting your scene with Arnold, you're going to turn on this Arnold render view like I have here. Press that red play button and then start lighting your scene. And you'll see the lights in real time right there in the render view as they update. Now eventually though, you're going to want to see what it looks like for real, right? So once you have your scene completely set up and lit, then you can increase all your samples and get a really nice high quality image, because working with it with low samples, it gives you the more immediate feedback than waiting for, even as long as we're waiting here, maybe a minute to get the final image. Just getting a couple seconds is much quicker, right? So here we go. This one just finished. It took 1 minute and 27 seconds. You can see it down here in the lower left corner. So 1 minute and 27 seconds compared to just a few seconds with the lower samples. But you do see that we have a lot. I'm going to hit the stop button. If I want to hit stop, I can then see the image without having to worry about, here we go, I can zoom into the image here. So now I'm zooming in, you see it's still got some grain, okay, it's not perfect, but it's got a lot less grain than it had in our first image with the lower samples. So what I can imagine is if you really want to have 0 grain, you may have to do some more samples. We have to play around a little bit more with our settings. All right. So again, whenever you have a good image and you want to kind of zoom in and look at it, I can press this 1-to-1 button to go back to the extents, zoom out to the extents. And then when you press play again, it's going to kick off another render. Okay, so when you do hit stop, that red stop button, it'll stop updating. So even if I were to change my light now, nothing changes in the image because it stopped updating the image. So keep that in mind too. Okay, so we've talked a long time here. This video is going on pretty long, and I feel like we barely talked about anything. But hopefully this gives you a little bit of an introduction to Arnold. Okay, so the Arnold rendering system, if you're interested in rendering, like Pixar level type stuff, you need to have a nice high quality rendering system. You see this one, I automatically have this reflection here, for example. I automatically have the green from the ground bouncing up to the blue on this surface. That kind of stuff you're not going to get in your standard Lamberts and blends that the Maya software renderer offers. You have to go through a lot more hoops to get this quality of a look with just these simple shapes and lights. Then it's really much easier with Arnold to get a much better looking image. So I highly recommend going forward, anything that you're rendering that's not real time, okay, is done with Arnold. If you want to render in real time, that means video game type stuff. Like I said in the last video or video before that, rendering in Substance Painter or something like that is much more like what you would see in Unreal or Unity or something like that. Okay? All right, I think we're going to sign off here. We're going to keep going with this topic, though, and this kind of line of thought for the next couple of sections. We're talking more about rendering in Arnold and how that works. And then we're going to get into some animation. So I hope you'll stick around with me with Maya 101. Thanks for watching.